An adult nephew of mine listened to some of my stories that I had on video on my website and in some of my shows. And I openly talked about my first orgasm. I openly talked about sleeping with men I wasn't married to. And he was appalled and talked to all the other family members, and they concluded that I had lost my mind. And there was no hope for me, and they never spoke to me again. So I now love them from a distance. I think the problem is that they expected me to stay in the same box I was born in. The box that said Oklahoma, Route 66, American Girl, and stamped, made in the USA. I was in that box for 18 years. My parents were the pillars of the community in this small town that I lived in. And they expected certain things of me, and I delivered because that's what I knew. I was in this box and I was very comfortable. My parents thought I hung the moon. I was a wanted child. They gave me boundaries so I would be able to be normal in society. They expected me to be friendly. I did well in school. I was president of the Future Homemakers of America. Now, just remember that. I was president of the Future Homemakers of America. And I was not rebellious in this box. I felt safe, protected, and I wanted to grow up and be just like my parents. So why would I want out of that box? But I went to college. And then I got in the home economics box. I majored in home economics because I wanted to hone my skills to become the best wife, mother, and homemaker that the world had ever seen. Back then, girls went to college so they could get an MRS degree. Now, in case you don't know what that is not an academic degree. It is a Mrs. Jones, a Mrs. Perkins, whoever it might be. While I was biding my time to get married, I was president of a social sorority called Tri Delta, and they confirmed what my mother told me, and that was, no man is ever going to marry you if you're not a virgin. So needless to say, I didn't have a lot of dates. I kept things intact, if you know what I mean. The summer before I was to graduate, I decided that I would go to Disneyland. My mother drove me out there with some other girlfriends of mine. And the theme park had lots of rules. I was in the Disneyland box now. You had to wear your skirt a certain length. You had to wear a uniform. You couldn't wear any makeup. You, of course, had to be on time. You had to smile and be friendly. And I was, it was easy for me to transfer to that box. Now, one day, Walt Disney drove up in his golf cart, and he got out of the golf cart, walked around, and then he walked straight to me. And he said, "You are the all-American girl." So Walt Disney confirmed what my parents had told me. So I was in the box, all-American girl, and I wore it with pride. But I had to go back and finish college my last year. And I was starting to get a little worried because no one had proposed. No one had asked for my hand. But this boy, because back then, if you were a spinster or you didn't get married, they called you an old maid, and that was a fate worse than death. But finally, a boy, kind of the boy next door, came around and he proposed. And I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I said yes. He was a young officer in the US military, in the Navy, nuclear-powered submarines. And we started our life together, but he was out to sea a lot. And what I started to realize is that I kind of liked it better when he was gone. So I was free to be who I was and what I wanted to do without any regulations, without any, any rules from him. I even wrote Admiral Zumwalt, who was a big admiral in the Navy at the time. And I wrote him about the hair regulations. And I said, they're absolutely ridiculous. Ridiculous. My husband walks around like some kind of freak. He doesn't look like a normal person. He's not fashionable. And I worked with Admiral Zumwalt, and the hair regulations for the Navy were changed. So as you can see, I was starting to get out of the marriage box, and the people around me were not very happy. My parents weren't happy. My husband wasn't happy, and the military family wasn't happy. No one thought this was a good idea. But of course, then my husband introduced the motherhood box. Now that's one I always thought I would be happy with, but the minute he brought that up, I began to think, no. In the pit of my stomach, I thought, if I go in that box, I'll never be able to get out. I don't want to do it. I'm not going to do it. I listened to my intuition for the first time, maybe, and I refused to do it. And of course, my husband filed for divorce. And because I wouldn't have children, the marriage box folded, went in the trash, disappeared. But looking back, I now realize that my husband gave me the greatest gift of all. He gave me my freedom. But now what I was going to do, and now, what was I going to do? There were no other boxes that I knew might be out there. I didn't have any future boxes to get into. But it was the 60s, and I found one day a beautiful wrap box in psychedelic colors. Janis Joplin was singing, "Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose." The box was labeled the Magical Mystery Tour, and I got in. This was the 60s. Women weren't wearing bras. They weren't wearing shoes. They weren't wearing makeup. They were carrying babies on their hip, or maybe not. They were serving on juries, getting credit cards in their own name. They were making their own money without depending on a husband or a man to support them. They were smoking these new cigarettes that smelled real differently and seemed to make everybody real happy. I heard Angela Davis speak in person. I saw a woman speak truth to power, and I understood race in a new way that I had never experienced it before. Hippies, that's what they were. That's what I was becoming. They were living in communes, and they were sleeping with whoever they wanted to. This idea of multiple sexual partners, right up my alley. I was in. In today's world, we would probably call it sex on demand. I had the reputation of tripping men and beating them to the floor. That was one thing I was known for. It was hilarious if you knew me now, because I lived this quiet life and I'm not that person anymore. But I live alone. I don't have sex. I don't have kids. I don't have pets. I'm just kind of real normal. Anyway, an interesting thing about this multiple partners is during the 9 years I was married, I never had orgasms. But when I got this multiple partner thing going, I started having orgasms, and I started to understand what other people were talking about. Now, what surprised me about getting out and into new boxes was that nothing bad ever happened until it did. Birth control failed for me, and I found myself pregnant. Now, I had lived through people having back alley abortions and dying. But today, or at that point, abortions were legal, and I was able to get one. It was the best decision for me. It was the best decision then and now. I have never looked back. At the time, I did not lose sight of the fact that I had an A+ in privilege, and that most women did not have the freedom that I had for this choice or lots of choices. So I've spent the last 50 years of my life lobbying for choice, giving money, walking the talk to keep abortion safe and legal for all women. I became administrator of the first abortion clinic in Austin. At this point in my life, I'm pretty talked out about abortion and what's happened recently with the Supreme Court. And I'm not going to go there. I'm activist weary. I'm just can't do it anymore. Over the years, it became real to me that I would never be totally free. Things were always going to change, and I was always going to be in another box. While thinking about what I was going to do with this story, I thought back to 1966 when I was in college. I wrote a paper. And in that class, I mostly got B's because I wasn't that great a student, but I wrote a paper on freedom and I got an A+. And the professor circled a quote that I gave at the end of my story. And in closing, I will quote myself. Freedom is just the choice to choose the kind of servitude that you want. Freedom.